What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Paul Triolo. Paul is Senior Vice President for China and Technology Policy Lead at Albright Stonebridge Group, where he advises clients in technology, financial services, and other sectors as they navigate complex political and regulatory matters around the world. This episode was inspired by an article Paul recently published for American Affairs titled A New Era for the Chinese Semiconductor Industry, in which he examines how semiconductor export controls levied by the U.S. Commerce Department have been received in Beijing, and how China's domestic chips ecosystem has responded. We spend the first hour assessing the state of the Biden administration's strategic competition with China in the area of semiconductors. Specifically, what the goals of the administration are, whether those goals are clear to Western companies that have depended on selling into the Chinese market for a large share of their revenues, and whether the administration itself is clear on what it wants to accomplish with these efforts. In the second hour, we examine the fallout from the 2022 and 2023 export controls, including some of the unintended consequences that could adversely impact major players in the Western chips ecosystem over the long term. We discuss the CHIPS Act and whether more needs to be done to support America's domestic semiconductor industry, and we also do a deep dive into China's response to these measures, including a new top-down approach to industrial policy and fully supporting open-source hardware architectures as a way to protect their companies from further restrictions. Lastly, we examine China's success in electric vehicles and whether this is a harbinger of what could happen in other sectors if American policymakers are not careful. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this timely and highly informative conversation with my guest, Paul Triolo. Paul Triolo, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
It's my pleasure having you all, Paul. You and I were introduced by Julius Krein of American Affairs after I read a recent article that you published that's on the site right now. It's the #1 article on American Affairs about the semiconductor industry and Beijing's response to the export controls that first went into effect in 2022 and then subsequently were updated in 2023. Julius was kind enough to offer a discount to Hidden Forces listeners. This is not something that I am taking any profit or cut in. I don't benefit personally from this, so it's the maximum discount we were able to offer. It's a 50% discount that you guys can use to join American Affairs. You know that I've recommended this journal many times. I don't do sponsorships or advertisements on this show, but when there's something that I really like personally, I feel I can speak to it without any bias. So David Goldman was also introduced to me by Julius Krein. And of course, Daniel Paris, who is a friend, writes for American Affairs. Michael Lind also writes for American Affairs. I'm pretty sure I've seen his articles there, as have many other guests of Hidden Forces. They do some of the best stuff out there at the intersection of politics and economics, really political economics, and the political realignment that's happening in the United States. So the discount code for that, I just want to say it up front, is Hidden Forces 24, no spaces, Hidden Forces 24, and you can go to American Affairs. I think it's AmericanAffairs.com. Is that right, Paul?
I think it is. Correct.
AmericanAffairs.com. And you can check out Paul's article, which is titled A New Era for the Chinese Semiconductor Industry, Beijing Responds to Export Controls. So, Paul, with that out of the way, We haven't really buried the lead here in terms of what the episode's about, neither the subject nor the inspiration for it. Before we get into the article, which is exceptional and in very much sort of American Affairs style, very lengthy and detailed, which I love, tell me a little bit about you. What do you do? What do you write and think about for the most part? And who is your audience? Who is your readership? Who listens to your commentary? Who invites you to speak? Who are the people that are interested in your ideas?
Great question, Demetri. So I'm currently the global tech policy lead at Albright Stonebridge Group. And I'm also a senior vice president. These titles are all sort of, the titles are what they are. I'm a senior vice president of the China team. So I work on a day-to-day basis with clients in the technology policy space. So this includes semiconductor companies, AI companies. We're doing a lot of work, of course, lately in AI around regulatory issues. And so the basis for my commentary and things like my Twitter feed, which I'm pretty regularly contributing to, is sort of an industry perspective on all of the complicated issues that are sort of buffeting the technology space, both, for example, on the industrial policy side, where governments are now intervening more and more in industrial policy, and also in things like export controls and technology restrictions. And so I'm writing on a day-to-day basis for clients, and then when a topic I feel maybe hasn't been treated as in-depth or sort of, the perspective of industry hasn't been as representative as it could be, I've chosen to write articles like the one in American Affairs Journal. And I was asked to do that originally, an issue related to the Chinese Semiconductor Industry in 2021. And then this latest issue I was asked to update that last summer by Julius. And it was a tough slog, I can tell you, because the topics get harder and harder in this arena to talk to people. They're more sensitive now, of course, than they were a few years ago. So anyway, I tend to try to bring a perspective that's different sort of from arguably from the Washington think tank perspective sometimes, and from, other folks who are commenting on the issues, like some of the guests you've had before, for example, Chris Miller. I know Chris well, and I was actually on his first panel that I was asked to critique his book. And so I know pretty well where he's coming from. But I try to bring very strongly the industry perspective, because that's sort of the world I work in on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's what I'm most excited about focusing on today, because we've done, I think, a good job in general focusing on the geopolitics of this issue. But we've done less of a good job on the commercial aspects. And this is going to be, again, the third episode in this sequence. Both Chris's episode and Dylan Patel's episode are in the related tab to this week's episode page, so people can check that out at hiddenforces.io. So, Paul, in the last decade or so, it feels like the Washington consensus has gone from being concerned about the long-term threat that China's rise poses to American hegemony in an almost abstract sense, to what feels like a frantic focus on how to kneecap China's economy, stymie its technological development, and contain it militarily. At the same time, there seems to be a split between foreign policy thinkers within this camp. Everyone seems to have become less confident in their assessments of a relative American power, but there are those who focus much more on how to bring China down, so to speak, versus a smaller contingent of people that are ringing the alarm bell about what we need to do to build up our own industry, that we can't simply expect to hinder Chinese development and stay at a relative lead. How would you describe the current state of affairs in U.S.-Sino relations, with a particular emphasis on the way in which government policy is materially impacting the economic prospects, opportunities, and strategic choices of companies, industries, and sectors within the Western alliance?
So I think that you need sort of a framework to think about this, and I've written quite a bit about this. So I think your question is right. How did we get from sort of 10 years ago where, there was a lot of concern about China's rise as a peer competitor of the U.S., but we've sort of woken up to a world where suddenly, technology is front and center in the relationship. U.S. officials talk about intense competition in the technology space. We have terms like small yard, high fence being thrown around. And clearly the sort of the zeitgeist in DC and in other capitals is, okay, China is a problem. We have to figure out how to constrain China's rise, particularly in key emerging tech and foundational technology areas. And we're going to use the available tools to do this. And we're going to think about this as as if China gets access to advanced technologies, then they could be used for some sort of military applications, and therefore we need to deny China the most advanced technologies. And that's taken a long time to gestate, if you will, over the last 10 years. And let me just highlight a couple of things that I think are important to note. There are these sort of issues that came up particularly in the era of Xi Jinping starting in 2012, which puts us within that 12-year time window, where his leadership over China and some of the policies he's pursued, things like Made in China 2025, Belt and Road, the National IC Investment Fund, military subfusion, the National AI Development Plan, all of these things mean that China itself has had a heavy focus on technology. And then the various US governments have reacted to this sense that China wants to be a much bigger player in all these spaces. And the language China tends to use in some of these in describing its aspirations are things like, dominant position in things like AI by 2030. Now, you have to understand, I think, the context in which China is pushing technology development. And oftentimes some of the language around that is very it's sort of directed at the Chinese bureaucracy, like this is now a priority. Let's go out and, do better in some of these key technology areas where China has lagged behind. And let's also, by the way, reduce dependence to the degree we can on foreign sources of technology in sort of core technology areas like semiconductors and then more recently things like AI. But what's happened is the view of China under Xi Jinping has become very negative. And so the paradigm or the meme that China is this long-term threat and that a long-term military threat has then sort of redounded back on the way people think in the US about technology, so that every technology now is viewed in the context of how could it possibly be leveraged in some sort of future conflict with China. And this is an interesting dynamic because we didn't have that 10 years ago. But now it's routine in commentary around China and U.S. relations to almost assume that conflict is inevitable. And so that sort of plays into this idea that technology and control of technology is critical because we have to prevent China from getting access to this or that technology that could have military applications. And that's the context within which all of these other issues that we'll get into on semiconductors and AI in particular have become so central to the relationship and concern that, that those technologies again, it'll have a military end use, but less consideration for sort of the broader sense of those technologies, which are all, in this case, very much, for example, dual-use technologies, and not, the traditional way of thinking about some of these things like weapons of mass destruction, which is from another era. But a lot of the tools that are being used to control these technologies are from that earlier era, which I'm sure you've probably discussed earlier on some of your shows. So that's the sort of backdrop of all this, is this concern in DC, growing concern about China's rise as a military power. And then, of course, Taiwan, I think, has to be thrown in here too, and also growing concern about Taiwan. And that also is one of the drivers, for example, of U.S. efforts to onshore advanced semiconductor manufacturing. So we have to talk about Taiwan and their risks around Taiwan too in this context, because they're very much related. And of course, again, all having a sort of a China nexus.
Yeah, you hit a couple of topic areas that I wanted to cover. And one, the onshoring that I actually hadn't even thought of. It's something we talked about before, but I'm glad you brought it up. So let's quickly just talk about dual use, because I think that's really important. During our strategic competition with the Soviet Union, the domain of competition was much more focused. We understood very clearly what that was. But today, so many of the commercial applications also double in the military domain, including just general cybersecurity and the vulnerability of software. Does that mean that in this version, in this sort of, if this is again, I don't want to lean into the Cold War analogy, but right, whatever this equivalent is it one that's going to reach much further and deeper into the mutual economies of each country, this strategic competition, versus what we had during the Cold War era with the Soviet Union?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the reason for that is because the Chinese economy and Chinese technology development is much more intertwined with U.S. and Western technology development than the Soviet Union ever was. And so by definition, if you're going to start targeting certain technology sectors, whether it's semiconductors or EVs or whatever, there's going to be a lot more linkages between the U.S. and Chinese economy, and there's going to be a lot more potential collateral damage, for example, if you're going to target these. And if the goal is to do it narrowly, but it turns out to not be so narrow, the second and the third order effects of trying to use those Soviet era sort of controls and thinking around technology are likely to have a much bigger impact. And then, of course, the other big difference, of course, is a place like Taiwan, which, if you look at some of the estimates of a conflict over Taiwan and the impact on the global economy, they range from like 3 to 10 trillion. 10 trillion is like 10% of the global economy. I think it's actually much bigger than that, or there's a different way to look at that, which we can talk about. But I think, yeah, I mean, China and U.S. and the West have a very, very different relationship than the Soviet era relationship with the West. And that means that all of these things have much bigger impact down the line.
Do you see this as structurally inflationary insofar as the U.S. and China and their respective spheres of influence are incentivized to independently create their own versions of the same technologies or systems rather than collaborate, which would be the more efficient development path?
I'm not so sure that inflation may be the lens to look at that problem. I think it's going to have a big impact on innovation, because you're basically, if you have to sort of develop two technology stacks, if you will, from the semiconductors to the AI development environments. I was talking about that at length this week with some folks in China about where that's going. And you're going to be investing in two different supply chains. There will be some overlap, and we can talk about where that would be. But yeah, it's going to be sort of duplicative. And so it's going to be sort of a resource sink that, you're going to be, in many cases, actually really very much duplicating the key pieces of that technology stack. And that's going to just slow innovation. So I think maybe the better lens is it's going to slow innovation, and it's going to prevent, for example, in the semiconductor industry, innovation typically spreads and diffuses within the industry pretty quickly. And so in China, you're going to have innovation happening that may or may not sort of go back into the mainstream roadmap, for example, of semiconductor development. And that's, we've never really been in a situation like that where, particularly with something as complicated as the semiconductor supply chain, where you're going to have these two different innovative paths that will end up in different locations, but will also mean that, a lot of resources will be expended trying to duplicate NVIDIA in China or duplicate Android in China or what have you. And so that's, I think it's hard to predict the full impact of that. But yes, countries will have to probably choose sides. And companies, of course, who are sort of in the middle of this don't really like the idea, for example, of having two different supply chains, one for China and Belt and Road, and one for Western Europe and the US and North America. That's not something companies, relish the thought of. So that's the challenge. We're sort of in this almost like a calm before the storm here, where some of this is happening in different parts of the technology stack, but we're not really in a fully blown bifurcated world quite yet.
So you mentioned AI. Semiconductors are obviously interconnected there. What other industries or sectors are at the forefront of this strategic competition? How would you rank each in importance, and how interconnected are they?
I think they're very interconnected. So I would put it in terms of how what I've called the Sullivan doctrine, and I think I did address this in the paper.
That was addressed in the paper as well, yes. Jake Sullivan.
Yeah, so in September, October, November of 2022, for the first time, you had a fairly clear articulation from a senior U.S. government official of what the technology space of concern to the U.S. government was. And the Sullivan doctrine consisted of three different things. One is small yard, high fence, which was the idea that you're going to control small categories of technology but put big barriers around them. The second was that the U.S. wants to maintain an absolute lead over China in key technology areas, which is a big deal just in and of itself. Previously, the idea had been there was a sliding scale, and so the U.S. preferred the U.S. companies to be several generations ahead of Chinese companies. But the third piece of the Sullivan doctrine was really the most important, and that was that these three pillar sectors, and this is advanced compute, biotechnology, and green technology, that these sectors are force multipliers and are of growing importance to U.S. national security and economic security. But if you look at that, that's a pretty big yard, right? Because advanced compute, for example, includes semiconductor manufacturing equipment, AI, quantum computing, and really arguably things like ADAS systems for, autonomous vehicles, for example, which sort of combine some of those advanced compute elements. And then biotech is a big area, including, genomics and all sorts of healthcare related technologies. And AI, of course, is part of that also, for example. And then in EVs, and the green energy, of course, is EVs, EV battery supply chains, critical minerals, a huge area there, right? Which is obviously of importance now to the administration in the supply chain kind of sense. And that's important because in the first area, U.S. and Western companies tend to have a fairly significant lead over Chinese companies in some areas, for example. Biotech is sort of, I would say, 50-50. There are lots of very capable Chinese biotech companies that are competing. And then in EVs, Chinese companies are very much dominant in terms of batteries and in terms of course, EVs with BYD and et cetera. So those technology areas are very broad and sort of undercut to some degree the idea of a small yard high fence. And then they're pretty broad and they're all interconnected. And then there's another overarching piece of that, which is data and data security. And that's something we should probably talk about too, because data is becoming a really important factor in all this. And last week we saw the administration, for example, release an executive order that's attempting to control transactions, bulk transactions or bulk transfers of U.S. personal data, for example, outside of the U.S. to countries like China. So data cuts across all of those three areas, arguably. And then those are very big and broad areas. I mean, just something like semiconductors is huge, right? Depending on how you slice it in terms of priorities for national or economic security.
Yeah, securing U.S. citizen data is an interesting one because in our recent episode with Byron Tao, who wrote a book called Means of Control, he makes the point that much of the data that the national security state collects and uses to surveil American citizens is data that is purchased in the open market. And this market is open to Chinese companies, to Russian companies. So that's one I actually want to ask you about because I'm curious how practical those steps are. I also definitely want to talk about EVs, and I want to talk about the specifics of what exactly U.S. policymakers are trying to achieve. You mentioned a little bit how the goalposts have changed. I want to understand where we are today. But before we get to those, I want just at a high level to create a timeline here because I mentioned, early on that we went from a view in the Beltway that the United States was going to have to deal with China in the long term. It was a long-term strategic threat, but there wasn't a sort of scrambling sense of urgency. And we went from this win-win approach to a kind of more zero-sum mentality. In your view, when did you notice that departure? When did the commercial players involved here begin to get a sense of this early on?
So I think arguably, the elements that led to that sort of start, and you can go as far back as you want on this, but I think that if you look at 2010 with the intrusions into Google, the so-called Aurora intrusions, which were eventually, I think, attributed to China, before even Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, there was a sense that China was, using cyberspace, for example, to steal intellectual property from U.S. companies. And so I think the senior U.S. government official called it, one of the greatest transfers of wealth in history. And so for the last decade, there's been this sense that China is using things like cyberspace to steal intellectual property and to benefit its industries. And then I think, you also had the whole process of China's accession to the WTO that eventually led in 2018 to the USTR report that set off the U.S.-China trade war, which was basically focused on things like Made in China 2025 and this idea that China was bent on subsidizing its high-tech industries at the expense of foreign companies and U.S. interests. And then I think what really turned the tide, perhaps in D.C., arguably, is the advent of 5G. And so in the period 2017-2018 in particular, there was this growing sense that China and Chinese companies, for example, were going to dominate this next generation of mobile communications. And this realization, of course, that there were no U.S. companies that were in that game. And that led to this whole issue of restricting Huawei and ZTE, for example, from U.S. and European networks. And this idea, again, that Chinese technology itself was a problem and where it was deployed and how it was deployed was a big issue. And then I think the other big piece of this was Taiwan, was the realization, probably in the 2018, same time frame, 2018, 2019, that the world and the U.S. in particular had a heavy, heavy dependence on Taiwan, particularly for advanced node semiconductors. And that came in the context, again, of this rising sense that China was this long-term threat, that conflict over Taiwan could become a real thing. And so that led directly to the CHIPS Act and the idea of onshoring technology in the U.S., and also to the sense that technology was the arena of competition. And that started in the Trump era, so that same period, 2016 to 2020. And then in the Biden era, for example, in the U.S., this idea of China and technology being sort of critical to the relationship and the subject of intense competition really took off. And then finally, it was the sense that there was a sense that China was using advanced technology, particularly things like AI, for nefarious purposes. So for surveillance, the idea that China is a sort of surveillance state, and we can talk about that. But the idea was that the meme that sort of took root and has contributed to this competition is that when Chinese companies have access to advanced technology, that the Chinese government is going to, sort of intervene and use that technology in ways that are inimical to Western interest. And so all those things kind of came together to form, again, the backdrop for this change in attitude towards China.
So again, in terms of this timeline, where would you rank the sanctions against Huawei in importance?
The sanctions against Huawei were really arguably a watershed because...
And that was 2019, right, if I remember correctly?
I can still remember where I was when I learned that Huawei had been put on the NA list. It's like where I remember when President Reagan was shot. I remember where I was because it was a big deal, right? We had sort of predicted that it would happen at some point. It was May of 2019. And if you remember, it came just after the U.S.-China trade talks sort of fell apart.
That was when the CEO's daughter was...
Right. That's when the decision was made to arrested
at the airport in Canada
as she was transiting in Vancouver. Correct. That was in 2019. That was before Huawei was put on the N list. And Huawei was put on the N list in 2019, May of 2019. And then, more importantly, the Commerce Department developed this thing called the Foreign Direct Product Rule to apply to Huawei, which prevented any company in the world from manufacturing semiconductors on behalf of Huawei if it used U.S. technology. So this was a huge and unprecedented extraterritorial extension of U.S. export control laws. So that was really big, and that really also focused minds in China about the types of controls that the U.S. was likely to implement on other Chinese companies, and of course that has come true. So yeah, the Huawei events were really big. And also, it's important to remember that, again, in the era of WMD, for example, those export control restrictions, like putting companies on the NA list, were usually targeting very small companies that were providing, a particular component, nuclear component that was clearly used in nuclear weapons to an end user, say in Iran. It wasn't used against complicated multinational companies like Huawei or ZTE that had these very complicated supply chains. So that also is a big difference in the way these controls were now being thought of as a tool to sort of, in this case, punish ZTE for Iran sanctions. Huawei's original listing was again sort of predicated on violation of 10-year-old violations of Iran sanctions law. But this was a new use of those controls. And heretofore, they had never been used against a big multinational company. And also, there had always been a presumption of denial. So no licenses, for example, were issued. But now, in the age when these companies had lots of supply chains in the U.S., for example, it became much more important for the Commerce Department to have a licensing policy. And we're still living with that today, the implications of that difficulty of balancing, the national security justifications for a company like Huawei or ZTE or other Chinese companies, and the fact that they're also still important parts of global supply chains and still important customers of U.S. companies, for example.
Yeah, so I also want to recommend to listeners a couple other episodes. There was one episode that we did with, how do you pronounce her name? Meng Wanzhou?
Meng Wanzhou.
Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the CEO and founder of Huawei. After she was arrested, James Vilvenin came on the show, and we did an episode with him on Huawei, and also John Pelson, who was at Lucent Technologies and really lived through much of the buildup of Huawei and China's telecom industry that would not have been possible, at least not at the speed of development that we saw, without relying on technology transfers facilitated by Chinese joint ventures. So I want to mention that we've kind of spoken in general terms about what the goal of U.S. policymakers is, but it also seems like they themselves are not entirely clear. They have a kind of a sense of what they want to accomplish. But what I want to delve into now is kind of on the specifics of what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So the October 2022 export controls on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing, and their subsequent strengthening and broadening in 2023, which I assume was in part motivated by, well, I guess they were already doing this, but it certainly came right after the Mate 60 Pro, which was very concerning to those who had crafted those export controls because they were able to manufacture through SMIC and their domestic foundry 7-nanometer chips using, if I remember, DUV lithography. So there was an urgency to kind of strengthen those controls. They widened technical parameters for semiconductors and manufacturing equipment. They imposed novel end-use controls. They extended restrictions on U.S. persons, which is huge, and that's something I'd like to talk about, which caused a lot of companies to have to actually shut down projects that they had ongoing.
Right.
And they also imposed new licensing requirements for approximately 40 countries beyond China. So what is your understanding 6 months later about what the goals of the administration and the Commerce Department are, given the specifics of the policies that they've enacted?
Great question. Great question. And I've written quite a bit on this because, again, from the industry point of view, the feeling is very strong and has grown, or I would say, more strongly since October 7th, 2022, that the administration's goals have changed and the goalposts have moved. So, for example, even before October 7th, if we look just at the manufacturing sector, because I think these are two very different areas, right? The manufacturing tools area, and then the GPUs, controls on advanced compute. They have different motivations and different goals, arguably. But on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment side, already well before 2022, for example, Chinese companies were prevented from accessing the most advanced lithography tools, the so-called extreme ultraviolet lithography tools manufactured by ASML in the Netherlands. And that was a result of a decision in the 2018 timeframe via the Wassenaar Agreement, which is this multilateral group that decides on things like dual-use export controls. And the U.S. proposed the controls that basically prevented Chinese companies from being able to purchase, like SMIC, from being able to purchase EUV systems. And again, that's the really cutting-edge system that allows you to get below
5 nanometers.
5
below
nanometers,
5.
right. And it's really hard to do without that equipment. A lot of the main fabs, particularly TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, obviously have gone down the EUV path, and we're already on the sort of second generation of EUV. But before October 22nd, then the Chinese companies could not access that. So if the U.S. goal was, for example, to prevent Chinese companies from manufacturing semiconductors at the most advanced nodes, that was already the case before October 2022. And so again, that's why there's so much concern in industry about this, because the October 22nd controls then tried to draw a line, which arguably the Chinese had already passed. They tried to draw a line at 16 and 14 nanometers for logic, and then 128 layers for memory, which is a whole nother completely different sort of sector and driven by different commercial and technology roadmaps, which was a surprise to industry that it was included. That's one of the goalposts that I mentioned in my paper that was changed. And then also attempted, so 128 layers for NAND, 3D NAND, that's the sort of memory in your phone that's keeping all your data safe. And then DRAM, which is, you think about that as the memory in your PC, for example. I tried to draw lines around all those technologies. And essentially, basically, the goal there was to freeze China at those nodes, for example. But again, as I noted, China was already prevented from going below roughly, say, 7 or 5 nanometers by the lack of access to EUV. So this was an attempt to prevent Chinese companies from using their existing equipment, as SMIC did to produce that chip in the MOT 60, to do that, to go below the sort of prescribed layers. But the problem was, the tools in question here, particularly lithography and other tools that are used to produce advanced semiconductors, are not designed for a specific node. You know, they're capable, usually they're bought and installed for a particular production line, but they're capable of performing at higher levels. And so that meant that, for example, before October 7th, 2022, SMIC already had all the tools it needed to produce that chip that came to light in last summer of 2023, the Kirin 9000S, which is used in their new smartphone. They already had that equipment. The techniques to use that tool, for example, for those more advanced nodes were well known in the industry. In a sense, then, the U.S. government was imposing controls on existing that affected existing installations in China, and that forced, for example, the tool makers, the U.S. tool makers that were providing support to tools in China at both logic facilities and memory facilities to pull their people out and essentially breach contract, right, by doing that. And so it created a real mess. And those companies lost considerable amount of revenue in that process and still remain concerned about that, because every year, for example, they're losing more market access in China because now the Chinese foundries are looking to domestic tools because they're worried about further controls, for example, on these tools.
And some of these controls have also put restrictions on the ability to service technology that's been transferred to China that's been sold to some of their foundries. For example, this has affected ASML.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's because the end-use controls that were implemented on October 7th, which again were unprecedented, as you noted, the other countries like the Netherlands, where ASML is located, and Japan, where other really critical companies that are part of the supply chain like TEL, Nikon, and Canon, those countries don't have export control laws which allow for end-use controls in the similar way, or controls on their domestic persons. And so the issue of servicing is complicated, but the bottom line is because those countries don't have those controls, U.S. toolmakers feel like they're at a real disadvantage because those companies can continue to service those tools in China, whereas U.S. companies have to pull their people out. And so that's contributing to this sense that the controls didn't really produce a level playing field. They primarily disadvantaged U.S. toolmakers.
American companies, yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is great because it kind of leads into my next question, which is who are the important stakeholders in this process? Of course, we have the U.S. government, we have foreign governments, we also have U.S. companies and foreign companies. How do you think about this? And then you've kind of hinted at it that there's been a lot of dissatisfaction, especially with the updates in 2023, growing dissatisfaction among companies, both U.S. and foreign companies. How do they feel about these policy changes, and what would they prefer to see done differently?
Great question. So first of all, let me just quickly outline the other part of this, because I think the semiconductor tool part is really important, and I think we've hit on a lot of the key points there. The other aspect which you mentioned, of course, in describing the October 7th controls were these performance controls that were, again, hadn't been done before on GPUs. And so that arguably comes from a slightly different point of view. I think arguably the semiconductor manufacturing controls, the sort of ultimate reason there is concern that if Chinese companies could manufacture advanced node semiconductors, particularly things like CPUs and GPUs, then those could be used, for example, for high-performance computing that could be used to model weapon systems, right?
Right. The restrictions on the sale of equipment and the servicing of equipment that could allow the Chinese economy to create leading-edge chips.
Right. But again, the important part there is that those leading-edge chips, only a small part of them would be used for high-performance computing that could be used to model weapon systems for military applications. So again, in all these cases, because of the issues I mentioned earlier around, China as a long-term threat, military threat, the solution then that the administration has been pursuing is trying to solve for that small part of the broader subset of these dual-use technologies that has a military end use. So for GPUs, this is then the flip side, which is, okay, there was growing concern about AI. Before, U.S.-China competition really heated up here, AI was really not that big of a deal. But I think what happened over the last 2 years in particular is the debate around AI has grown, and this idea that AI could, for example, give a country a military advantage has also sort of grown in stature, if you will. So the GPU controls that were implemented in October 2022 and updated in October 2023 on GPUs were very much directed at slowing Chinese companies' ability to develop advanced AI algorithms.
To train large language models like ChatGPT.
Right. Well, originally, it wasn't just about ChatGPT, because actually the October 7th controls in 2022 came out before ChatGPT came out. So that's, again, one of these interesting issues where U.S. officials had talked about the GPU controls initially as sort of vaguely worried about military applications. But then in December, after the update to the October controls in October 2023, Commerce Secretary Raimondo, for example, for the first time said, well, the reason we're controlling GPUs is because we don't want Chinese companies to be able to train large language models, frontier models.
But in fairness, though, the administration was not completely blindsided by the progress that some of these firms were making. They are presumably in contact at some level with Microsoft, with OpenAI, with Google, with Facebook.
Yes, to some degree, but they were probably in less contact with the progress of, for example, of large language models in China before ChatGPT sort of came on the scene. So the motivation, I think, for the AI and the GPU controls, though, goes back to like 2019, 2020. And so really precedes the frontier model or, generative AI model era, because, AI isn't just about generative AI. Even before that, AI can be used, AI applications were used for many different things. They could be used for decision making, command decision making, and other things. But it was really the generative AI sort of revolution that really, I think, sort of upped the ante. But again, when somebody like Secretary Raimondo says that the goal of those GPU controls is to control Chinese ability to train large language models, that's a big deal, right? And we can get into a little bit of the debate around that, because now AI is in the US, for example, is very much the growing concern stems from national security concerns around cybersecurity that you mentioned early on, around the potential for these models to enable people to design biological weapons or nuclear weapons even. And so the sort of AI has become now a big part of the equation. And generative AI, of course, is still really important thing. It's part of that equation. But before that, there was still concern about long-term about China's ability to develop AI.
So the name you dropped there a couple of times is Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, just for people that didn't catch it or aren't familiar. So I want to go back to my original question, which is about stakeholders, because I think what would be incredibly helpful for me is to understand on a very specific level, who are the people involved and what does this process look like? Because for those of us that are not connected to this, we hear the headlines, but at the end of the day, it's people. It's people in the Commerce Department. It's people in the private sector. It's people in government in the Netherlands, in Japan, in South Korea, who are involved in this process. So how detailed are these communications? Are these conversations? Where are the conversations happening? How are they happening? Who's leading them? What's the level of competency? Just give us an overview of what you understand about how this process is going and who's leading it.
Great question. And again, I think it differs in country by country, but in general, in Western
let me actually, before you give that answer, Paul, one more question, because that's a great point. But these aren't siloed groups of people, right? They have to interface at some point because the rules that the U.S. is putting forward are impacting the governments in South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands, and their companies, et cetera. And they have to have some form of recourse and some way to petition the government to maybe change a rule. Also, it's up to them whether or not they want to impose those restrictions. And as we've seen, there's been a two-tier response. And U.S. companies are at a greater disadvantage in certain areas. So is there an official vehicle through which business is conducted, or channel through which business is conducted, or a virtual place, so to speak, where these different stakeholders are able to meet in order to begin to work these kinks out? And is this going to eventually lead to some kind of, or do we need to have this lead to some kind of larger allied commercial framework going forward to manage this growing strategic competition?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So again, we have to focus on understanding how the export control system has worked previously. So previously in the Soviet area, there was a thing called COCOM, and COCOM was designed sort of like, it was a multilateral group that was designed to control technologies going to Russia that might be of military use. So traditionally, there have been these international groupings that focus on this kind of thing, controlling technology, controlling nuclear technology. You have the Nuclear Suppliers Group, controlling missile technology. You have the Missile Technology Control Regime. So there are these various international groups, mostly Western countries that are, of course, are manufacturing the technology, that have coordinated aspects of controls around particularly WMD. Now, in the sort of dual use era, of course, we have this thing called Wassenaar, the Wassenaar Agreement, which is where the US, for example, has proposed controlling certain kinds of technologies like EUV, for example. And then that includes a lot of Western countries in Europe. It also includes Russia, unfortunately. And so what's happened is, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and that conflict, that grouping has become sort of dysfunctional. And that's why, for example, we had this tentative three-way agreement between the US, the Netherlands, and Japan over these controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, because Wassenaar is not functional. And so normally what the US would have done would have been proposed those controls, gone to Wassenaar, discussed it. It's a very slow and cumbersome bureaucratic process, though. It takes a long time. So the US government probably, in this case, preferred to do this on a sort of smaller basis, only two governments that needed to be engaged. But those discussions happen at sort of the Commerce Department level in the US. The Commerce Department is responsible for export controls. It has has an interesting role in that it's also responsible for promoting U.S. businesses abroad, but it also is in charge of implementing and drafting and implementing export controls. But that policy in the U.S. is also usually driven from the White House, right? From the administration. The executive branch decides on generally what type of controls and what type of policy it's implementing with respect to Russia or China, and then those controls are then implemented by the Commerce Department. And then the Commerce Department will interact with similar entities. For example, in Japan, it would be METI, the Ministry of Economics and Trade and Industry. And in the Netherlands, I believe they were interacting mostly with the Ministry of Trade there, because this is sort of a trade issue. And so those, at a sort of working level, there is a certain amount of collaboration that happens. In addition, in the Trump and Biden era, primarily in the Biden era, we have something called the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. And that was what I traditionally called the transatlantic interagency. And there was a lot of collaboration between governments in the US and the EU around things like export controls. And that actually is what led to the export controls that were eventually implemented against Russia in response to the conflict in Ukraine. So that was, there are these mechanisms by which governments discuss the implementation of policies. The actual policies, though, are set at a higher level, right? And so in the US government, the National Security Council, for example, is the body that typically coordinates U.S. government foreign policy and also technology policy. And that's why Jake Sullivan, I mentioned earlier, the Sullivan Doctrine, he heads the National Security Council in the U.S. And that's where the policy on China and on technology is coming from.
So you've said that the willingness and ability of governments in the Netherlands and Japan to align their own semiconductor tool makers with evolving U.S. controls is a, quote, major wild card. And I want to understand why. Because it seems to me, and this is something that we'll dig into in the second hour, that there's a mismatch here between what U.S. policymakers believe allies like Japan, the Netherlands, and South Korea will accept, and what those countries are actually willing to go along with, which is why I made the point earlier that in order to make this long-term strategic competition between the U.S. and China, or the U.S., its allies, the Western Front, whatever you want to call it, and this new coalition of countries that's forming around China, in order to make this work long term, it seems to me that we need to have new institutions or new allied commercial frameworks in order to be able to communicate on these fronts. So that's something that I want to dig into in the second hour. I also want to get into what I'm particularly interested in, which is understanding how Beijing has responded to these controls. Because one of the criticisms that I've heard levied against the administration, the U.S. administration, and how they've conducted these export controls and the way that they've gone about it, not just by you, but by others as well, has been that they focus too much on kneecapping China's industry and not understanding that at the end of the day, as you have said, this is applied science. And the Chinese, if they throw enough money and personnel and smart people, and they have plenty of smart people behind the problem, they can eventually find a way around it. And you and others don't seem particularly optimistic about the ability of this strategy to work, absent a focus also on building up our own semiconductor industry and making the necessary investments domestically as part of a larger industrial policy, which is the last sort of point that I want to get into in the second hour, Paul. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Paul, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Paul, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.